PWHL Vancouver and Seattle have picked their first players. We'll go over that and what we expect coming up for both teams.
This is the Women's Hockey Report presented by Locked On NHL. Your weekly look at the world of women's hockey. From the PWHL to the international stage, it's the Women's Hockey Report on the Locked On Podcast Network. Your team every day.
Hello, hockey fans. Welcome to another episode of the Women's Hockey Report, part of the Locked On NHL channel, which is part of the Locked On Podcast Network. Erica L. Ayala here, alongside co-host Rachel Donner, and we now know who the first players for PWHL Vancouver and PWHL Seattle will be. They're signed, and there's more to come ahead of the expansion draft. We're going to talk about that. We're also going to talk about a decision the PWHL PA made regarding salary disclosure, what we like, what we think can be improved, and why they made this decision. And then we'll close out with some U18 updates. But Rachel, let's get right into it, and let's talk about who was selected for Vancouver and Seattle. Let's start with Vancouver. Who are the first players on the board?
Yeah, it's really interesting because they are the first of the two teams to fill their 5-player signing slots, and they got a nice mix of players. They're all Canadian, though, which is very interesting, especially being in Vancouver. 2 forwards in Sarah Nurse and Jennifer Gardiner, and 2 defenders in Sophie Jaques and Thompson, who played together in Minnesota, of course, and goaltender Emerence Maschmeyer.
Yes, indeed. And so I like this sampling. Not surprised that they went with Canadians first. I mean, it's a Canadian market. You have their general manager has been with Hockey Canada for a while here. Also love that some names that we have talked about on our last episode, not only did they go unprotected, but we see that they were taken in the expansion draft. I did a little bit of that on Locked on Kraken, and I definitely picked Jaques and Thompson, but for the Seattle team, because again, I'm the host of Locked on Kraken, but I like keeping them together. They talked a little bit about being roommates in Minnesota. No word on whether they'll be bunked up again in Vancouver. Maybe they'll get their own spots now that they're in Canada.
Really?
I thought also, it was interesting to hear from Emerence Maschmeyer because, of course, we haven't really heard much from her since the injury, but we'll get into that in a little bit. Rachel, let's first let everyone know who is going to Seattle. Surprise, surprise, with the first name announced.
Yeah, of course, Hilary Knight, which was the biggest non-surprise of the signings. I think, like, once we knew for sure that Boston Fleet did not protect her, it was pretty clear that she was going to sign with Seattle, and she did. She talked about why she signed a 1-year contract. I think that really took some people by surprise and some people not by surprise, given that she's already announced her quote unquote retirement from the international game. But it's certainly an interesting aspect of her choice to go there.
Yeah, for sure. And we'll get into some of that in a little bit. But who else is joining Hilary Knight in Seattle?
Love Alex Carpenter, reuniting with her USA teammate in Hilary Knight there. I think Carpy had a bit of a struggle finding her place in the Sirens lineup, and this will be a good fresh start for her there, I think. And then also Danielle Serdachny, who I think had some similar problems in Ottawa, couldn't quite get to the peak of her potential there. So that was a cool signing. And then Cayla Barnes on the blue line.
Yeah, so we see that there is not exclusively, but definitely more U.S. players, U.S.-born players that are playing for PWHL Seattle. And, you mentioned USA hockey teammates. There's 3 of them right off the hop, so that's going to be interesting. So let's now get into a little bit of a deeper dive into what we heard from the media availability that happened on Friday. As you alluded to, Knight and Carpy talked about in that media availability specifically signing 1-year deals, but they're not the only ones from all of the players that have signed with an expansion team in this early window. Sarah Nurse, Thompson, and Jen Gardiner also signed 1-year deals. And what we heard from Hilary Knight and Alex Carpenter, Knight especially, was that this is not anything as far as a foreboding or, any insight that she will retire. She said it a few times now since it was announced that, she would be a part of this expansion. It doesn't seem like she's retiring from pro hockey. She said, not verbatim, but something to the effect of, I'm not planning on, making a move. She really sounds excited to be in Seattle. And Alex Carpenter said the same thing. So, I mean, Nurse, Thompson, and Gardiner didn't get into that as much, if at all, really. But for me, I wonder if this is more about salary construction and roster construction and salary considerations, given that these teams will have other players to take in the expansion draft. They'll have an entry draft, and they can kind of divvy out different contracts, maybe giving Seattle a little bit more leeway, or not just Seattle, but both teams a little bit more leeway. Also, maybe there are some things coming down with the PA that we are not privy to. I think this just is a way to test the waters for the players and the franchise, and maybe renegotiate once they get a little bit more of an establishment of what the league and, of course, what their now new franchise is going to look like.
Yeah, I think, Sarah Nurse specifically, to my recollection, and please correct me if I'm wrong, but was the only one in the media availability that mentioned having talked to both teams ahead of signing with Vancouver. And so, with her signing a 1-year deal with Vancouver, I'm sure what you were just talking about was part of those conversations she had with both teams in terms of what their plans were, in terms of overall roster construction, the tones of the team, and the kind of teams they were looking to build, and the kind of culture they were looking to build. And that's something that Nurse specifically mentioned.
Yeah, indeed. I think another thing that I found interesting is that, I don't know. We heard from Boston players first, and then the Vancouver players. Well, they former Boston players.
Yeah.
The former Boston players. Thank you. The Seattle players, especially, excuse me, Hilary Knight. Hearing them speak, I didn't really get a full understanding, and maybe it was unclear, I guess, is the way that I'll say it for now. It was unclear to me on how much autonomy they had about being unprotected,
Yep.
about where they were going. It seemed like I heard things from the players that maybe alluded to a little bit of both and. Whereas with the Vancouver availability, Sarah Nurse had, I asked her, and then there was a great follow up, I believe, from the gentleman from the Toronto Star. There's also the Toronto Sun. I'm like, who's going to come up with the Toronto Moon? Let's go. But with Sarah, she talked about, and I think MASH got into this a little bit as well. There was a little bit of conversation in exit interviews, which most teams, right, at an elite level have exit interviews with their players, regardless of if there's expansion or not. And so MASH and Nursey kind of talked a little bit about those exit interviews, difficult conversations, business-like conversations that happened once they realized, okay, they were going to be on the unprotected list. And I just felt like we got a little bit more detail, or the thought process, from the Vancouver players. It was maybe it's, player to player, was a little individualized, but I don't know, Rachel, did you pick up on what I did, that the Boston players, it seemed like there was maybe a little bit more autonomy there? I'm sorry,
Yeah.
Seattle. I did it again.
Listen, because we're talking about Hilary Knight, so it's only fair, because she is the one Boston player to have signed with a new team thus far. But I think that, or at least as of recording, but I think that, yeah, she was asked specifically about, did she know what was the process of the protection list for the Boston Fleet as it related to her individually. And she did not answer the question at all, but alluded to the fact that there were definitely behind the scenes conversations that were had, and they could have been the exit interviews like every team does, to your point, but that she did end up in a place that was good for her personally. And that's kind of the bridge she was willing to build at the moment. And I think, it's up to each of these individual players to disclose what they want to disclose, but she's not talking. That's for sure.
Yeah. And Carpy, I think, as well, gave like hints of, Well, I kind of wanted this change, so maybe wasn't completely surprised to be protected. But then there was a question asked directly. I think it was to Carpy. It was either Carpy or Cayla Barnes, where it was like, well,
Mhm.
how does it feel to not be protected? And it's like, oh, well, business, da 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 da. And I was like,
Mhm.
that's interesting. We'll have to cut the clips and post them on social media. So if you're not following the Women's Hockey Report on the Locked On NHL YouTube channel or on our TikTok channel, women's_hockey_report, make sure you do that because you can then listen for yourself. But so, Rachel, we have the first few players. It's interesting. Vancouver, they have maxed out on the early signing window, whereas Seattle got it right that time. Seattle, they can still sign one more player. They've got to, at the time of this recording, get it done pretty soon. But they can. So we might see some news before the expansion draft coming up next week. And we're going to talk about what that timeline looks like, what everything means, and who maybe is still available that Seattle in particular might want to consider. We'll get into that coming up on the Women's Hockey Report.
Ever check your bank account and wonder, where did all my money go in between dining out, online shopping, and entertainment? It's sometimes easy to lose track, and that's where Monarch Money comes in. It's your personal CFO giving you full visibility and control over your finances. Monarch Money isn't just a budgeting app, it's a complete financial command center where you can track all your accounts, investments, and spending in one place so you stop just managing your money and start building wealth. And when I started using Monarch, I realized just how much I was spending on food delivery and takeout. And now I can budget smarter and save a lot of money. And instead of juggling multiple apps, I use Monarch Money where I can check those financial accounts, track spending, and plan long term goals. So take control of your finances with Monarch Money. Use code LOCKEDONNHL at monarchmoney.com for 50% off your first year. That's monarchmoney.com, code LOCKEDONNHL for half off your first year.
All right, so we know who the first players to the expansion teams in Vancouver and in Seattle will be. Hilary Knight, not a surprise. Sarah Nurse did talk a lot about just being from the GTA area and embarking on something new. This expansion. Now we've seen a few different iterations of women's pro hockey, but to my recollection, Rachel, we've never really seen an expansion draft like this.
No, it's absolutely wild with having this signing period before a draft, because normally it's just a draft where you have a certain number of protection slots and then there's like a coin toss or something to see who goes first if there's multiple teams and not just one. Of course, with your Kraken, that was an extremely memorable selection experience with the big outdoor event. That was really fun to watch with all these like really cool people announcing the
I was
players. But
there. I was there. It
yeah.
was so hot. I actually brought an umbrella because I thought it might rain. I just keep a little compact umbrella, but I was using it and like had it in front of my computer so it
Mhm.
didn't overheat. That's how hot it was.
Yeah, this just seems like a whole other ball game here, so to speak. And so with this signing period, I think it's a really great thing for the players because it gives some of them some real clear autonomy in terms of choosing where they'll go next in such a fraught expansion period. When you go from 6 to 8 teams, like it's a high percentage of players are going to be somewhere new, obviously, with 4 players from each team potentially being chosen here. So I think that it's just a really Wild West kind of thing, literally, as this league expands west. But I think it's been interesting to see, who's gotten signed first. Now we know some of the behind the scenes about those discussions. Some teams have already maxed out their 2 selected players, so they got a 4th protection slot added, which kind of helps them a little bit. But yeah, it's been crazy.
Yeah, and I think another thing that we maybe didn't expect comparative to if you are someone that follows the National Hockey League is that these are big names,
Mhm.
these are not players that you would expect to be let go by teams. I mean, we had talked about Hilary Knight. I know we talked about Sarah Nurse. I would have protected her, but here we are. What can we do? Alex Carpenter was surprising to me. We talked about this as well. Like, why would a team that struggled the way New York has let go of Alex Carpenter unless, and it goes back to what we were saying in segment one, right? Unless there were conversations and just like, you know what, don't even bother protecting me because if you keep me, I'm going to force a trade. I don't know if it got to that level. I don't know that we're exactly there quite yet, but I think
Right.
that's something that you see in other leagues, right? Where players effectively force trades. We've seen in the WNBA superstars like Sylvia Fowles, Elena Deladon have opted not to play a season until they could either be a UFA or force that trade. Jewel Lloyd most recently requested a trade. So we see that. But I think with this is where, Rachel, the fact that this league is owned by just one ownership group, that really comes in because you can curate, right? And kind of manipulate the drama to where Hilary Knight becomes unprotected. And then
Right.
everyone who covers your sport and even just the casuals are going to talk about that. And so I do think we have to at least consider that some of what we're seeing for this first go round in expansion is
Yeah.
also about the narrative.
Yeah, I think so. And, it's not just Hilary Knight. Like Danielle Serdachny was the second overall pick in last year's draft.
Right.
And so for her to move to a new team is a little like bonkers to begin with, right?
Right. Right. Yeah, it's kind of wild.
Oh,
So
and Claire Thompson was the third pick. So,
yeah,
you know,
yeah. So we have to keep that in mind. That I think at least part of this is to give the two new markets some star power, as opposed to traditionally with expansions it's you think of players that are going unprotected as effectively, I mean, expendable, at least to some extent, right? Which is why the Emerence Maschmeyer thing, and then I want to go over, what to expect now in the next phase of expansion. But
right.
Emerence Maschmeyer, I thought, had a really great conversation. First, she did effectively confirm that she's expecting to be ready to go by puck drop of the upcoming season. She also talked about, yes, there were some difficult conversations that need to be that were had and needed to be had between her and Ottawa. She talked about, which I thought was heartbreaking and a little funny at the same time. I didn't realize this, but that she became the goaltender to get. I knew she had gotten over like her 1,000th save. So becoming the first goaltender to get to 1,000, like I knew that, but I didn't realize that 1,000 and 1,001 came immediately before her injury. And so in some ways that milestone and setting that history for the league is so closely associated still with not then being able to play after that, which I was like, oh mash, that's heartbreaking. But what she also said, she showed so much love and respect for Gwyneth Phillips and said this is now an opportunity for both of us to be the ace or the number one. So I thought that was really gracious and kind of her while also being real.
Yeah.
Can y'all tell? I definitely think we got more juice from the Vancouver players than we did from the Seattle players.
100%. 100%. I mean, they were a lot more forthcoming. And I think that, I do agree that Emerence Maschmeyer had a lot of really good things to say and really could just kind of understood, well, that's the way the cookie crumbles. And we're both great. And I think she appreciates, I think goaltenders in this league appreciate more so than skaters about what the opportunity truly is in this league, because there are so few goaltending spots available in women's pro hockey right now in North America that, just to get one of those jobs is a huge deal. And I think she really reflected that.
Yeah, that's an excellent point. I think you nailed it there. Another thing that I'll say, and then we'll move on to give people the rundown, the timeline, is that Sarah Nurse talked about prior to the PWHL, everything was personality based or, about personal relationships. And that's also something that she said that she is expecting that that's how Kara is building this team. But she said that her time in Toronto, because she had such experience with Gina and Troy, thinking about the national team, that she really went into her PWHL career in Toronto and really tried to focus on the business aspect. She also talked about, the Jocelyn Larocque trade in some ways, in hindsight being a way to prepare for what it actually means to be a professional league, because no one thinks of Jocelyn Larocque anywhere else than Toronto. And for that trade to go down, it's like, oh, okay, like here we are. This is a part of what we've been fighting for, it's almost like I got the sense that she's like, how you know something, but you don't really know until you know? Like that's the vibe I was getting from Sarah Nurse on that. And so we're going to get more of this, because these are the first players, Rachel, but not the final players to be selected. Seattle still can select one more in the early signing window if they want. But then, Rachel, let's talk about what fans can expect on the actual expansion draft day, which is coming up next week.
Well, I would like to know what to expect, Erica. I really would, because, even as of the press conference that the newly signed players have, there was an indication that we would be receiving information about what this expansion draft would be like, but to our date as of recording, we still don't have that. All we know is that it is Monday at 8:30 Eastern, 5:30 Pacific. It will stream on YouTube, and that's it. That's what we know.
Sure. We also know that, is it 7, right? Another 7 players?
Well, as of now, it'll be 7 players for Vancouver and 8 for Seattle. But if Seattle fills that one more spot, then in a signing before the deadline on June 8th at 5 p.m., then it'll be 7 each.
Right. And just to mark it, we are recording Friday immediately following the press conference. So if anything happens between now and Saturday morning that we don't talk about, it's not that we in real time don't know. It's just that we, as of right now, don't know.
Yeah.
But to your point, so we do know how many players will be selected by each team, but we don't know the order. We don't know how that order will be selected. We don't know the run of show. I know I got a little bit in my feelings about the run of show for MVP of the playoffs. So I just don't want anyone to have an awkward moment like that. I mean, I don't expect that to be, but like, are we going to have players patch in? Like, are we going to get to hear from them? Is it just going to be a list? Like, yeah, all of the things we're still waiting on.
Yeah. So all of y'all's guess is as good as ours, but I'm certainly hoping, or anticipating, I guess is the wrong word. Hoping's the wrong word. Anticipating that there'll be some sort of dramatic coin toss like device live to figure out the order. That would be my guess.
That would be dope.
And then they'll start the picking from there. And
reaping.
Yeah. Oh my God.
That was too dark. I'm sorry.
I know. Well, and we do know, based on the 4th player protections, at least as of now, the Minnesota Frost chose to protect Britta Carl Salemi. The Montreal Victoire chose to protect Erin Ambrose, I think, which was the right choice. And the Ottawa Charge chose to protect Gabby Hughes. Yes. So those players are off the board. So
cannot be selected in the expansion draft, which leads us to, if we were these teams, Rachel, who's in the mix? I just want to throw it out there. Like, let's talk about that coming up. And then we're also get into some PWHLPA news. That's the union, or the Players Association. They announced something, and then quickly we'll give you an update on U18. But coming up, Rachel and I will give who we would pick for either one of the teams, given who's still available. That's coming up on the Women's Hockey Report. All right, we are going to wrap up this episode of the Women's Hockey Report with doing a little GMing of our own, couch GM, whatever, virtual GM, however it goes. If we were building our fantasy teams here, Rachel, given
Yeah.
who's available, and we can go with some names that we've already mentioned on previous episodes, but who do you think would be just a great pick up for either one of these expansion teams, given who's still available?
I mean, I think my first choice would have to be Ashton Bell from the Ottawa Charge. I think, I personally would have protected her over Gabby Hughes, although I don't think there's a wrong answer there per se, because again, different positions and it just depends on what your priority is. But I think that she had a really tremendous season for Ottawa. And I think, she's not super flashy and isn't going to put like a ton of points on the board, but her defending work is so strong and she's everywhere out there. And I think if you're looking to build a strong, like solid blue line, like she's a great place to start.
Yeah, I think that's a solid choice here. And just a reminder that at least in this window, which is quickly closing, and this is more specific to Seattle, I believe, right, who's also available are free agents, anyone who's not considered or their rights are not under contract. So that would include players like, you know, Michaela Grant Mentis, Katie Tabin, just sticking with Montreal for a moment there. That would include Teresa Vanishova for Ottawa, as an example. I believe Cheyenne Darkangelo is available, Natalie Spooner, Jessie Comfer, CJ, Carly Jackson, Haley Skamura. For me, I mean, I don't think this is a surprise to anyone, but I absolutely love Vanishova's game. Yes, you might have to deal with some penalties, but I think the upside of just at that size, the power, the strength, and the effectiveness that you get is huge. Also, just putting it out there, we've only had North American players go so far in the expansion. So would love to see someone that comes from outside of the United States or Canada go. So Vanishova's high on my list. However, Rachel, let's talk about goaltending, because Corinne Schroeder is another name that maybe was a little bit surprising to see as far as protected versus unprotected. Is that a good goaltending option as far as of right now, I should say? It's only Vancouver that has selected a goaltender in that signing window. Who do you like for Seattle with regard to goaltending?
God, I don't know. This is what's really tough here because I feel like, yeah, Corinne Schroeder is a good option, but I think there's also a reason why she hasn't necessarily been signed yet. I think there's some consistency issues there, and maybe you're looking for another option, whether it's a free agent signing or through the draft to build your goalie core. I think those are valid ways to approach it. Also, like Nicole Hensley is out there.
Rooney too,
So
right? Isn't Rooney a free
yeah,
agent?
yeah. Rooney might be a free agent, but
Yeah.
Hensley was on the official Minnesota Frost must be protected list.
Right.
So
Right.
like that might be the direction I'd go if you're looking for an existing goalie.
Yeah, that's a good point. Yeah, I mean, obviously Rooney was in net for the most recent championship. Not exactly equitable, but a maybe 60-ish, 40-ish split there for Minnesota down the way. Elaine Chuli is an interesting option. We talked about Maschmeyer, knowing that by coming to Vancouver, that gives both she and Gwyneth Phillips an opportunity at significant minutes. Elaine Chuli, hard to get minutes when you're playing behind Anne-Renee Desbiens. Completely makes sense. And could does she become a true number one in the PWHL? I don't think we know as of right now, because the last time we saw her as a true number one was when the Toronto Six won the PHF championship, the last ever. So, that could be an option as well. But I guess we'll have to wait to find out, Rachel. But something interesting, which unfortunately I think we'll also have to wait for as the public, but the PWHLPA, the Players Association, has agreed to disclose salaries. Now, this will be internal. And so this will be a resource that players have. But it was interesting, Rachel, to hear Sarah Nurse talk about not only the timing of that comparative to expansion draft, but also why the PA, because she's on the executive board, why the PA made that move. What stood out to you from what Sarah Nurse told everyone today?
Yeah, I think it's just the difference between having it be an internal resource for players. And I think, and I get that, right? Because everybody wants to know about what everybody else is making to help them in their negotiations. And I think that's like a rising tide lifts all ships kind of decision there. So I think it makes perfect sense from an internal perspective. But the choice to keep it internal is what makes it interesting, that at least as of now, it won't be public and there's no specific path to a time or a timeline
Yeah.
to start disclosing that information.
And that's one thing I was extremely critical of immediately when this CBA was announced, that as well as that it just seemed really short comparative to what we've seen in other leagues as far as like the amount of pages, what's actually there. There are also some things that were a little vague, and it's like, oh, well, we'll get there when we get there, but we're not going to say in what timeline. But one of the things is this, because I think they're right. What they got right for me, Rachel, is that yes, this does help to express value, to be able to argue for value when it comes to players, but also making those public does that twofold, if not more, in my opinion. And it goes back to something Sarah said about experiencing and leaning into the professionalism of this league. Pro sports, it's like your weight, your height, your hometown, and your salary, at least on the men's side. I think in women's sports, we're still seeing a little bit of a pushback, unless it's like I'm in Oklahoma City right now to cover the Women's College World Series, and there's an NIL player that's the first $1 million NIL athlete for softball. When we get those like first numbers or the number that significantly raises, we're proud and happy to say that as a women's sports kind of landscape. But the day-to-day stuff is as important, if not more important, to really gauge where the sport is and if it's headed into a direction that is equitable, that is on target for creating salaries and an ecosystem that is going to be something that can be a full-time job for everyone, not just for the top tier players.
Yeah, I agree. And I think that, especially in this day and age of salary cap management, in conjunction with what we talked about earlier, with this league having a single owner in effect, I think that that aspect of this business model is affecting that decision in a lot of ways, because if the money all comes from one pot, you can't really, like, what does the salary cap mean?
All questions that wonder if we'll get answers to. So, we were able to have Malika Underwood alongside Kendall Coyne Schofield talk a little bit about the PA. They're having a new executive director. That is Malika Underwood. I wonder if as we start to see that group become a little bit stronger and have more autonomy, if these are things that are on the table. So we might have to circle back, because we did talk about some things that are on the whiteboard, so to speak. And Kendall Coyne Schofield mentioned that we probably have outgrown practice players, right? And reserve players. And then, of course, they talked about wanting salaries to go up as well. So we'll have to see if we can circle back to that. But before we close out, U18 USA Hockey, they name a head coach. So someone familiar to USA Hockey, but also, Rachel, familiar to PWHL fans.
Yeah, so it is interesting because Courtney Kennedy was hired as the USA U18 head coach, and she's a current skills coach for the Boston Fleet. She's been an assistant coach, former Olympian in the USA Hockey system there. And I think, U18s, they won silver this past year, and she was an assistant coach. And yeah, I think when in the USA versus Canada rivalry, and we saw like other countries really match like USA and Canada's game, and USA's in particular. And I thought there were some interesting weaknesses to Team USA's game at U18s this year. And so to hire from within, I think, is a really interesting choice here. I'm not saying it's bad. I don't know yet it's a to be determined thing, but I think it's an interesting decision to make.
Even pulling away just from the U18 level or the anything under the senior level, I don't know that USA Hockey has the strongest, and by strong, at least for right now, I mean consistent coaching pipeline. And that might be something that we have to keep an eye on. We know Brianna Decker, since that unfortunate injury at the Beijing Olympics, really hasn't stepped on the ice as a player since then, but has leaned more into the coaching side. But other than Bredex and now, Courtney Kessel, I don't know that we have a lot of mainstays. And so that's just something, to your point about one, hiring from within, but also what does that pipeline look like? Because, you can't hire from within, or you can't have good hires from within if you're not kind of feeding that pipeline, which to me seems a little sparse comparative to on the Hockey Canada side. We've seen more legends of the program transition into being mainstays as coaches, as advisors, as scouts. So that's going to be interesting. And to that point, also on this coaching staff, Michelle Shelley Picard, but also Haley Skarupa has been involved as a GM for a while. Skarupa was a part of that gold medal team in Pyeongchang, and then effectively transitioned into more off the ice and behind the scenes, including with USA Hockey. So that's something I will be keeping my finger on the pulse with when it comes to what the programs for USA Hockey and then, of course, Hockey Canada look like. And we can talk about all of that and so much more, Rachel, but we'll leave it here for today for this episode of the Women's Hockey Report. By the time we air our next episode, which will be out on Saturday mornings on the Locked On NHL channel, we'll know who is taken in the expansion draft. So we'll break that down, see who is on Vancouver and Seattle, and which franchise we think, at least on paper, is looking to wreck it in the PWHL and maybe give Minnesota a run for their money. But for Rachel Donner, Erica L. Ayala, make sure you follow us on TikTok, women's_hockey_report. And be sure to subscribe to the Locked On NHL channel on YouTube. Set the notifications so you will also get notified when the Women's Hockey Report is live. We'll catch you on the next episode. Enjoy the expansion draft in all its glory, whatever that may look like, and we'll catch you on the next episode.